There's a lot of different types of ballot measures, which I won't get into. But this is a type of direct democracy in action. The people vote about the law. So that's good, right? But writing laws is complicated and it's hard for the public to understand all the details. And sometimes the official pro and con materials are vague or perhaps even a little misleading. So you need to learn how to figure out a ballot measure. And I hope that this presentation provides kind of a model for how to take apart a measure, how to check the facts, and then make a well-reasoned decision. All right. So what is Prop 1? Let me read you the title of it. Mental Health Care and Addiction Treatment Reform and Bonds to Build Places for Treatment and Supportive Housing. That's the title of the proposition. Now that's a mouthful, and you got a lot going on there. You've got mental health, you've got addiction, you've got reform, you've got bonds, you've got supportive housing. This title is saying a lot, but it's not actually telling you much. So let me give you some background to understand why Prop 1 is on the ballot. Okay, first part of the background is homelessness is a problem. We have a statistic here from the Department of Housing and Urban Development that says there's about 181,000 people experiencing homelessness in California. And you don't need this statistic to know that homelessness is a problem. You see it every day. You see the encampments, you see people sleeping on the sidewalk. On campus, we hear about students who are sleeping in their cars. We know this. And so I'm sure that you're aware that homelessness is a problem that the state is trying to solve. Second part of the background is that mental illness is also a problem. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness in 2021, there was 1.2 million adult Californians who have serious mental illness. Now, so we have 101.2 million people in California with serious mental illness. And obviously, not all of those people are going to have family to take care of them and act as a case manager. And also, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, for many people, cost is a barrier to getting mental health treatment. And so you can understand that for a certain part of the population, they're going to need some help. They're going to need somebody to provide mental health services. And the third part of the background is that these two issues are related, mental health and homelessness. There are 181,000 homeless in California, and 75,000 of them are going to have a serious mental health or substance abuse issue. That's more than a third. So there's a clear overlap between the issues of homelessness and mental health. So it makes sense that these solutions to the problems need to involve both housing and mental health services and substance abuse services. So what's the current solution? What are we doing to deal with mental illness as a problem right now? Well, each year, about $2 to $3.5 billion is generated by something called the millionaire's tax. And that's technically called the Mental Health Services Act. But to make it easy, we're going to call it the millionaire's tax. And so any income over $1 million gets a special 1% tax, and that money goes to fund mental health services in the state of California. And currently, 95% of this money from the millionaire's tax is given to the counties to provide the mental health services. All right. And so they're going to the counties, the money is, in order to provide the services kind of at that more local level. Now, what kinds of services do counties offer? Well, here's a list of the services that are provided by the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health Services. And so they provide case management, crisis intervention, medication support, peer support, and rehabilitative services. So that's what the County of Los Angeles does with the money that they're given from the millionaire's tax. Okay, now let's talk about Prop 1 and how Prop 1 is going to change these things. There's two parts of Prop 1. First, it borrows money. And second, it changes how existing money is spent. Let's go over both of these parts of the proposition. First part, borrowing money. It's going to borrow $6.38 billion. and it would pay this back with interest over 30 years. Now, the money to pay it back comes from the general fund, which is each year the tax revenue of the state. And that tax revenue is the general fund, and it's used for all state programs and then to pay back debt. So we would be adding to the part of our general fund that has to go toward paying off debt. So 6.38 billion that we pay back with interest over 30 years. Now, the second part, changing how the money is spent. This has two parts to it. First, the state is going to get a little bit more money from the millionaire's tax. And so right now, 95% of the money from the millionaire's tax goes to counties. Prop 1 is going to change this so only 90% goes to the counties and 10% goes to the state for state programs. And so that comes out to $140 million going to the state for its programs instead of going to counties for their programs. And then the second way that they change how the money is spent is that it requires the counties to spend more money that they get on housing programs and not just mental health services. And so it's taking away a little bit of the money, and then it's saying with the remaining money that you have to spend more of it on housing for people with mental illness, not just services. All right, now how much of that money will be designated for housing? It's hard to find a specific number. The source considered the most objective on these matters is called the legislative analyst. And according to that document, the percentage that will have to be spent on housing will be determined later based on some decisions that will be made. I found some numbers that estimated it, what it might be, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So, what is the state going to do with the money that it gets? Well, it's borrowing money and it's taking some money from the counties. What are they going to do with it? They're going to do two things. First, you've got 4.4 billion is going to go to a state program. There's a state program that builds mental health treatment facilities. And this program already exists, but its funding is running out, and Prop 1 gives it money to continue its work. So what are these places for mental health care that the 4.4 billion would be going to? Well, the legislative analysts describe these types of places as programs such as places where people can stay for a short amount of time to receive treatment for drugs and alcohol, places where people can stay while they transition from intensive mental health care to lower levels of care, and places where people receive the most intensive treatment and care, such as psychiatric hospitals. All right, and so that's 4.4 billion is going to these places to provide treatment for people who have mental illness and addiction issues. Now, the other 2 billion is going to go to a state program to build housing, and that state program, currently what it does is it gives money to local governments and they turn hotels and motels into housing. And then that 2 billion is also going to go to building some more housing. So that's what the state plans to do with the money that they get from Proposition 1. Okay, let's start off with what the supporters say, then we'll do what the opponents say. All right, so what do the supporters say? Well, I have a quote here from the official Yes on Prop 1 fact sheet. And this is the soundbite that supporters are using over and over again. It's what they lead with. And so that's what we're going to start with. They say, the initiative will create supportive housing settings where over 11,000 Californians with the severest mental health needs can live, recover, stabilize, and thrive. So they put out this figure of 11,000 supportive housing settings. Now, how does that break down? Well, 4,350 housing units is going to be generated, and then 6,800 temporary spaces for treatment. Those are the ones that I read you, like the places to get sober, the psychiatric hospital, places for mental health treatment, those kinds of places. And so it would provide facilities for treatment for 6,800 people with mental health or addiction issues. Okay, supporters also say that the measure gives $1 billion for veterans experiencing homelessness, substance abuse issues, or mental health challenges. And this is true. The proposition sets aside half of the housing that it creates for veterans who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness due to mental illness. Supporters also say that the counties have some other sources of funding besides the money from the millionaire's tax. Now, found this point made in the Los Angeles Times in their article where they endorsed Prop 1. They say that counties have other ways to pay for mental health services. The money they get from the millionaire's tax is only about a third of their budget, maybe more. That was kind of a sketchy number to pin down. And the rest comes from other taxes or the federal government, or maybe some new Medi-Cal reimbursements. All right, so they say that the counties can continue to do their work because they have other sources of funding. The supporters also say that Prop 1 can reduce the number of mentally ill persons who end up incarcerated. And this goes with their slogan, treatment, not punishment. Supporters also say that we need to address homelessness and mental health issues together through behavioral health housing. And this goes with the slogan, treatments, not tents. And so supporters say we must address these together. And so this is kind of a big picture point that mental health and homelessness are related, and we need what the Prop 1 people call behavioral health housing to address the issue. And supporters also say that Prop 1 is an essential part of broader efforts to address a complex issue. In its endorsement of Prop 1, the Los Angeles Times said that Prop 1 is not meant to solve the problem of homelessness, but it's part of a package of solutions to address what's a complex problem. And the proposition targets one segment of homelessness, and those are the homeless people who are homeless due to mental illness or addiction issues. It's not meant to solve the entire problem because there isn't any one solution to the problem of homelessness. It's targeting one specific group. Okay, so who are these supporters? First of all, the governor supports it. It's kind of his project. But here I have listed people who submitted comments to the official voter guide in favor of the proposition. And so the supporters were the California Professional Firefighters Association, the Veteran Mentor Project, the California Association of Veteran Services Agencies, National Alliance on Mental Health, California, California Chamber of Commerce, and the Orange County Coalition of Police and Sheriffs. So those are the groups that want to support this and are putting their names behind it. Now, that's one thing, people who are openly supporting it, but who's giving the money? Who is working behind the scenes? Well, here's a list of the major donors to the official Yes on Prop 1 campaign. The Federated Indians of Grattan Rancheria, Sutter Health, California Hospital Committee on Issues, Kaiser Health Foundation Health Plan, and Members Voice of the State Building and Construction Trades Council of California. So we have some health organizations, and we have a building and construction trade council. So that's what's going on with the pro Prop 1 side. Let's look at what's going on the other side. What do the opponents say? Okay, well, opponents say it's not 11,000 housing units. It's broken up. The number 11,000 isn't the number of housing units. It's going to build 4,350 housing units. And then the other 6,800 or so are temporary spaces for mental health treatment. These aren't long-term housing units. And remember that the number of homeless in California is around 180,000, and Prop 1 provides 4,350 housing units. So opponents want to point out that we would borrow $6.8 billion to get 4,350 housing units, which doesn't seem like a lot for the solution of homelessness right now. So that's one of the opponents' positions. They also say it's expensive. They estimate that at least $9.3 billion would be needed to pay it back once you consider interest. Opponents say that Prop 1 is going to cut important county services by $140 million or more. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, there's not very many details about how much of the money that counties get has to be shifted to housing. So I'm not sure how we got this figure here of 35% that comes from the Californians against Prop 1. But perhaps as much as 35% of the money that the counties are getting from the millionaire's tax is going to have to go to things besides providing services. It's going to have to go toward these housing programs. All right. And opponents say that the voters approved the millionaire's tax because they wanted the tax money to go to mental health services and not to other purposes. All right. And so the voters approved proposition in the past to fund mental health services, and opponents say that Prop 1 ignores what the voters thought they were going to be spending the money. Opponents also say the counties are doing a good job with their funds. It's not like they're just frittering them away and they're not doing their job. Now, when you see someone on the street who's obviously suffering from mental illness, it's easy to think that our mental health services are failing. But what you don't see are the people that are getting help. And here's a quote from the Californians against Prop 1. They say people helped by the county services programs are the ones that you mostly don't see. Their lives are stable. They understand their mental illness and have help to keep it in check. They have housing. Many have jobs. They're not being arrested. So opponents say that cuts to county funding would hurt these programs that are doing a lot of good. Opponents of Prop 1 also say it allows funding to be used for locked involuntary facilities. Now, this is part of a broader debate about how to deal with people who suffer from serious mental illness but refuse treatment. Initially, when Prop 1 was being written, the governor promised that the proposition would not have any funds to be used for locked up involuntary facilities where people are forced into a treatment facility. But that promise didn't make it into the final version. And so it doesn't prohibit it. And so I just want to be clear, the proposition doesn't require that money be spent on locked involuntary facilities, but it does nothing to prevent it from doing that. All right, so who are the supporters? People who submitted to the Vote No material in the official voter information guide are all mental health associations. And so we've got Mental Health America of California, California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organizations, and the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance of California. So those are the official supporters out in the front, publicly supporting it. Who's the money behind the Prop No side? Who are their major donors? None. The official yes on Prop 1, the official yes campaign has $11 million, and the official no campaign has $1,000. And we don't know who gave that $1,000 because it's such a low amount that they're not required to disclose it. And so this means that the people supporting the campaign have financial backing and the opponents basically do not. Okay, so in summary, Prop 1 is going to borrow $6.38 billion, and it moves some money around from counties to the state and from mental health services to housing for people who have mental illness and substance issues. And so a no vote means that we don't borrow the money and we don't move the money around. All right, so that's my summary of the two sides and the facts that they have been putting out there. All right, do we have questions at this point? I think it's question time. Anthony?
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for those. So I'll go ahead and start with our first couple of questions that we have. So the first question is, how many counties are in California? And if so, does that mean the 3.5 billion is split amongst all those counties? And what would happen to the other 5%?
Okay, that's a good question. I have to admit that I don't know off the top of my head how many counties there are in California, but there are a lot of counties. And the money is divided up among the counties, probably, I do believe, based on the size of their population, how many people that they need to serve. So Los Angeles County is going to get more money and things like that. And how the cutting or moving the money around is going to affect the counties will obviously depend on each different county. So the issues that are facing Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles are going to be different than Kern County or places like that. And so some places will probably continue their services, but with smaller staff. And so more people will be on everybody's caseload. Other counties might have to cut out entire programs as their way to deal with it. And so obviously, if there's less funding, they are either going to have to find some new funding, or they're going to have to cut services, or have, I don't want to say layoffs, but maybe reducing the amount of people over time, and giving each case manager a bit larger caseload. And so I think that's how counties, those are their options. Those are just the basic options that organizations face when they have budget cuts.
Thank you for sharing that. And then the next question we have is, how did they come up with the $6.4 billion?
The $6.4 billion, I'm not sure why they picked that number. I think that they laid out their plans for how much housing that they wanted to build, and that's how much it was going to cost, and housing and those temporary facilities as well. And they probably put some strategic thought into it, like what's the most we can ask for that the voters are going to approve. We don't want to come in with a number too low. If we could get 6.4 billion, let's go for that. And so it could have just been a strategic decision that that's what the market would bear, that the voters might agree to that much. Because I mean, if they could borrow double that, they could make double the housing and supportive temporary units, and that would address more of the problem. But I think that the 6.4 billion is what they felt comfortable asking the voters for.
Thank you. And then another question we have here is, what are locked involuntary facilities?
Okay, that is a really good question. Locked involuntary facilities. That would be a facility where you would put somebody who is suffering from severe mental illness and doesn't have the ability or the willingness to treat it or to follow treatment. And so those people might need to go to a facility. This is part of a bigger debate, but go to an involuntary facility where they are sort of forced for treatment. And again, I want to clarify that, and this might be when I listed those different types of housing or of temporary housing for people with mental illness and substance abuse issues. Those would be things like sobering facilities and maybe psychiatric hospitals. And so I would imagine that it's the psychiatric hospitals that the opponents are concerned about. And so that has to do, and I'm not saying that that's an argument for or against the proposition. That kind of depends on your stance on this broader issue about what do we do with people who refuse treatment for mental illness.
Thank you. So another question we have, and this is a two-part question. So we'll go ahead and start with the first question to that. With something like Prop 1, how do we know that money won't be diverted elsewhere, like the forced gas tax that was supposed to fix roads, but was moved to address clean energy by Governor Newsom? That's the first part of the question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, in some ways, Prop 1 is a diversion of the money from its original purpose. And so the voters voted, I think it was called Proposition, I forget what the number was, but it was in 2004, they voted for the Mental Health Services Act to generate this income for mental health services. And then Prop 1 diverts that money to some of it going to housing. And so in some ways, this is a diversion, but it was one that would be approved by the voters, because the voters are deciding if they want to change what the voters of the past voted for. Now, there's also the issue of money being diverted sort of unofficially or through different means, such as misappropriation, those kinds of things. I'm not familiar with the gas tax diversion necessarily and how much of that was kind of done on the side versus approved. But that's always a risk. Is the money going to be spent for what it's supposed to be spent for. Now, I know that programs that receive this funding are under a great deal of scrutiny and oversight. And so I think that there's probably some cause to feel confident that the money is going to be spent on the things that they say it's going to be spent on. And I guess we'll see if they build those houses or not. So there's no guarantee that every dollar is going to go to where the supporters say it's going to go to.
Thank you. And then the second part of that question is, based on how the state manages taxpayers' money, is it difficult to support taking on more debt for future generations? Can we trust the state to properly use funds as best as possible?
That's a really good point. I don't really have a clear answer to that, in that it's hard to know if the state government is going to manage things well going forward. But it definitely is increasing the debt of the state of California. And that is an important consideration. And so as you're making your decision, you'll have to think about that. Do you think it's okay for California to increase its debt? Should we be working within our means? Those kinds of issues are really important to consider. I don't want to take a stance here and say, yes, it's okay to borrow the money, or no, we shouldn't. But that's definitely an important consideration. And it's important enough that the opponents to Prop 1 have really forwarded it as one of their main arguments against Proposition 1.
Thank you. And then if Proposition 1 is passed, will we be able to see where the money is being taken / moved from?
Yes, all that would certainly be made public. The budgets for the counties are public. Anybody can go in and look and see what money is being spent on. And I'm sure that the watchdog organizations are going to be looking to see how much of that money did end up being moved around. Now, is it going to be delivered, this information, to the public in a way that they can understand? Maybe, maybe not. It's probably, the information will definitely be out there, buried in the bureaucracy, in the filing cabinet or the folder somewhere. And it would be up to different lobbying or watchdog organizations to check those things and to publicize their findings. And so it's one of those things where, like, we hope that they're spending it on what they're supposed to and all of that. And also we want to know in the end how much is going to be shifted around. And so that information will be out there, but it might be difficult for the average person to find it.
Thank you for sharing that. And another question we have from one of our attendees is, what was the cost per each house / treatment location?
Okay, I did the math on that, but well, it's difficult. Well, it's not that difficult. Let me scroll back to the slide that has the numbers. Okay, so we have, let me find another slide. Sorry about that. It's, I'm trying to remember how much of the money of the 6.38. If somebody else got the math for me? Because it's not the 6.4 billion, it's part of it. I think it's the 4.4 billion divided among 4,350 units. So how much is that? Let's see, 4 billion. Sorry, I'm trying to do math on my phone while everybody waits. 400. $1.4 million per unit, I think, is what I came up with. Now, these are going to be units that have some supportive services, but Yeah, like 1.2 million. That sounds like the right number.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to remind everyone on the attendees, if you have a question, if you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions as well. So the next question we have is, so if homeless people refuse service, what are some other alternatives?
That's a good question. First of all, I just want to emphasize that there is a lot of diversity among the homeless population. And definitely there are some who are refusing treatment for mental illness. But it's important, though, that we don't use that as our image of all homeless people or of all people who have mental illness. Okay, so a lot of them are availing themselves of treatment. Now, what are the options if they don't? Honestly, we obviously haven't figured out a solution to that, which is one of the reasons why you see those 75,000 people who are homeless and suffering from mental illness and addiction issues. And the question of what to do about that is a question that the state is struggling with right now. There's things like the care court and changes to conservatorship, which are trying to help people who aren't willing or able to help themselves. And that is a big debate because if they won't voluntarily get treatment, then the options are they get involuntary treatment where we have to put them in a locked facility and make sure that they are getting the medication they need to treat their mental illness and hope that once they're stabilized, they can go back and live. That would be, but then the other option is obviously just letting them live on the street. And that is contributing to the problem. And if I had an alternative, like we don't need to put them in involuntary facilities, we don't have to let them live on the street, there's a better way. I wish I had another solution to that. And all I can say is that is a difficult question that the state is trying to address right now. And they worry because in the past we had state institutions where we locked up people who were mentally ill, and that didn't go so well. But at the same time, what else are the solutions? And so it's an area where people have a lot of opinions based on the history and based on things like disability rights, the rights of people who have mental illness. And so, unfortunately, there isn't an easy alternative or an obvious alternative where we could fund something that would solve this problem. It has to be, are the two solutions that we've tried so far are, involuntary and then just letting them live on the street, not giving them any assistance or forcing any assistance on them. So I wish I had a better answer to that question. I don't think anybody in the state of California has a good answer to that question in terms of, is there an alternative to the involuntary treatment?
And this is a follow-up question based on the previous question. Have we identified the usual reason as to why the homeless are refusing service? Because enforcing service may lead to severe controversy?
That is another really good question. Why do some people who are homeless and suffering from mental illness refuse treatment? Well, I can think of some reasons. I'm not an expert in that area, but it could be that they have had some bad experiences with treatment in the past, that maybe they weren't treated very well in a facility. It could be that they are in the throes of mental illness that prevents them from recognizing what's going on. So, for example, if they have extreme schizophrenia or are experiencing extreme bipolar disorder and they're having delusions, they're not willing to avail themselves of treatment and trust people who claim to be trying to help them. And so those might be some of the reasons why people would refuse treatment. And, for some, it might just be, defying authority or some personal reason. But that would be sort of my guess about why some people would refuse treatment, because treatment might be extremely unpleasant, and it might they might not have any faith in it, and they might not trust the people who would be providing that treatment.
Thank you. And then another question we have is if they put if they put a homeless structure next to your home, Prop 1 does not allow you to contest it, correct?
Um, I'm not certain about that. Um, I don't know how um, the approval process for a homeless shelter or a mental health treatment center would go down. I know that in the current system, it's typically something that needs the approval of the city where it's going to be located. And so city councils are often the ones who vote on the location of things like shelters and treatment facilities. And I know this because the city that I live in refused to approve a homeless shelter for many years, which led to some issues where it's not allowed to move people off the streets, force them off the streets, if the city doesn't even have a homeless shelter to take them to. But eventually the city did agree to do that, to build the shelter. In my reading of it, I did not come across anything that indicated that it would change the rules about where homeless shelters can be built or in terms of who at the local level gets to approve them. And yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that, but if you want to continue to add
No,
on to
that's fine. That's all.
Another question we have from one of our attendees is, does the money go to a specific government organization that manages the housing or to nonprofits that have government oversight?
Okay. The money that the state is going to use, they have two programs that are already in place. One that provides the temporary treatment facilities, and the other that that builds the housing units by converting the hotels and the motels into housing. Now, who is going to pay for the upkeep of those and the running of them? That's going to come from the state budget. And the program that turns the hotels and the motels into housing, that's done at the local level. And so the money is given from the state to localities to do those conversions and to run those. And so that's an ongoing cost. And the state is going to be paying for that because they're going to be state facilities, even though they were developed at the local level. So these are going to be ongoing costs. And I do believe that if they're state facilities, the costs of those will be borne by the state.
Thank you. And then just wanted to share this from one of our attendings, which is a concern that they have. They said, I am concerned that the campaign for the Prop 1 is largely organizations who profit from its passing. Their excessive funding gives me pause, money grab, question mark. Deals for healthcare and building. I don't know if you have any answer or thoughts to that concern.
Yeah. Well, when you follow the money, that's always where you can raise concerns. The health organizations that are spending the money, let me pull up that slide. Those are major health organizations like Kaiser. And so I think that they might be wanting to get into the business of providing mental health treatment services, or they're providing those and they want to be able to expand them with assistance from the state. And so, yes, they do have a financial interest in it, as do the building and construction trades. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't vote for it? Well, that depends on how you feel about these organizations and if what is in their best interest is also in the interest of the state or the interest of the people of the state. And so that is always something important to look at, is who are the donors. And I'm glad that you're seeing the connection as to why these donors would be interested in supporting this proposition. That is a good skill to have in always trying to take apart the ballot measures. And another thing related to that is that sometimes there's the official supporters who are all these feel-good organizations like Veterans for American Freedom and Police Who Love California and the American Excellence Institute. Sometimes these are just lobbying organizations with really fancy sounding titles, and those are the official supporters, but that's different than the donors who are giving the money. You have to go down, scroll down, and find the people who are behind the scenes giving the money. And that tells you more than the people who have their names put on the flyers as supporting it.
Thank you. And then another question we have, and this is, I'm assuming this is correlated to Prop 1. It's a 30-year loan with interest.
Yes.
And then another concern that was brought up by one of our attendings is that they wrote, many unhoused people say that they would rather sleep on the street in their community because the facilities provided are worse. Overcrowded, long lines, they can't even sleep, or they have to be out by 6. So any thoughts to that comment?
That is a good comment. Shelters are not a good solution to the homeless problem compared to housing, right? A lot of people who are homeless would be happy with some modest housing, but they don't want to go live in a shelter for the reasons that our participant just mentioned. And that's why you see a lot of people living in encampments, people who, again, they don't want to be in that shelter system for a variety of reasons. And so there, again, that those would be people who are somewhat resistant to treatment or resistant to the shelters. But things might change if there was housing available, right? And so you can't really compare shelter living to housing. I would imagine that people, if they were offered housing, would be a lot more interested in it than being offered a bed at a shelter.
Thank you for sharing that. And another question we have here is, what is the benefit of taking local money away and giving it to the state, since local government knows the needs of the population with mental health needs better than the state, since it's local government, they understand the city better?
That's a good point. And that's the reason why the money from the millionaire's tax was initially given to the counties, because the counties know what they're doing at the local level. Now, what's the rationale of the Prop 1 people for redirecting some of that money? Well, they would say, first of all, that they're not taking away too much money. They're only taking away another 5%. And so they're saying that they need a little bit more money from the millionaire's tax to go to the housing programs that the state's going to put in place. And then they would say that the money that is left at the counties is going to be divided between more housing versus services, but the decisions about how to spend the money in those different categories would still be left up to the counties. And so if they were told you need to spend 20% of your remaining funds on housing, it would be up to the counties to decide what that housing would look like, where it would go, those kinds of things. And so the rationale that the Prop 1 people would say for taking some of the money for housing is that we need the money for housing first, then treatment, or, treatment and housing, but we need to put more into the housing than we have been. And so that would be the justification that they give.
Thank you. And then another concern that's been brought up is that the potential issue of exploitation, where some who are not struggling may exploit the system that is created for those who need it. So any thoughts on that concern?
So, for example, somebody who is not really at risk of homelessness, getting access to some of the housing facilities that are being built and things like that. I suppose there's always a risk of that. Though getting into public housing, I think that there's a great deal of scrutiny involved in that application process. And so that would be an area of fraud or people taking advantage of the system that I think would be really difficult compared to other areas where certainly people do take advantage of the system. And but I don't think that's as big of a concern when it comes to the facilities that Prop 1 is making. If you've got the money to go to a nice rehab, I don't think you're going to try and scam the state to get into the state-funded rehab. But I mean, there's always a risk of those kinds of things, of some people slipping in that could afford to deal with their problems on their own.
Thank you. And then, are there any other resources available to make students or voters in general educated about their votes? And if there's any other resources you would like to talk about aside from Proposition 1?
Absolutely. In fact, I have some more slides to do that. Um, and so what else is on the ballot for March 5th, and how do I educate myself about the election? Um, well, there's some major races that you'll be voting on March 5th in the primary election. And the first one is the presidential primary. Now, this is a party primary for the presidential election. So the Democrats get to vote for which member of the Democrat ticket is going to be on the ballot. So obviously that's Biden and then the people who are running against Biden. So if you're registered as a Democrat, you'll be voting in that. If you're registered as a Republican, you're going to vote among the Republicans. So that's Trump and a bunch of other people like Nikki Haley. If you're registered with the Peace and Freedom Party, you get to pick between Claudia de la Cruz, Jasmine Sherman, and famous intellectual Cornel West is running. And so that's what's going on. Now, if you register to vote as no party preference and you want to vote in one of these party primaries, or if you want to change your party preference so that you can vote in a certain primary, you can change your voter registration. You actually re-register, and you can do that by February 20th. So that's obviously the presidential primary. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that going on. There's some other major races. There's the race for, there's the hot race for the open US Senate seat. And as always, there's the seats for the House of Representatives. If you live in LA County and you are voting, you can vote for who will be your district attorney. That's a very controversial race. The incumbent George Gascon certainly has critics, and that's going to be an interesting race. You also get to vote in local elections like your city council and your school board. And depending on where you live, there might be local ballot measures. So for example, the city of Long Beach has a proposition to raise the minimum wage for hotel workers. You can vote on that if you live in the city of Long Beach. If you live in Huntington Beach, there's a ballot proposition about voter ID and election laws. And the city of Westminster has a proposition about increasing sales tax. So there's statewide ballot propositions, and then there's local ones too. Now, there's some useful resources. Voting can seem complicated because you need to figure out the logistics of voting. You need to figure out what you're voting on. You need to figure out where you stand. And so it's understandable to feel like you're not qualified to vote, but you're as qualified as anyone else, and there's resources to help you. And so the first resource is the Secretary of State official election website. And does somebody have the list of resources to put in the chat or the Q&A? I emailed that out earlier to Ricky and Anthony. And so I also, if you're looking at your computer screen, there's a QR code here you can scan that will take you to that Secretary of State website. And so you can do a lot of things there. You can register, you can track your ballot, you can find your in-person polling place. And if you don't want to mail in your ballot, you can find out where to vote there. Next, I highly recommend a site called vote411.org. And so if you write down only one thing or you screenshot anything from this presentation, it should be this, vote411.org. You go to this website and you put in your address, and it shows you what will be on your ballot, where you live, what are the city council districts you're in, what's the school district council, all of the things, who will be on your ballot. And then you can go through and click on different candidates and compare their responses to a series of questions. So vote411.org. There's a similar resource called Ballotpedia, where you can look up what's on your ballot and also get information about the various races and the propositions. Now for local information, if you're in the city of Long Beach, you can go to the city clerk's office website, and that will give you the information about who's running for city council. The Long Beach Post also has an elections site where they ask people who are running for office questions in a questionnaire, and then you can look at what the candidates' answers to those questions were. The Los Angeles Times also has a voter information guide where, again, they give out questions and the candidates answer them, and you can click to compare. There's also resources, a very similar one from the Orange County Register. And so that does the candidate comparisons for the people who are running in Orange County. And then you should also look for your voting materials in the mail. A lot of stuff's going to come to you in the mail. So first, you probably got this. If you're living where you were registered to vote, you're going to be getting election materials sent to you. All right. And so this is my official state voting guide. It's got rained on because remember the rain. And so this tells you all about the ballot measure, and it has the full text of that Proposition 1. There's also your county guide that will tell you who all the candidates are for any election that's happening within the county. You also get a ballot in the mail. This is my son's ballot. It hasn't been opened yet, so you can see what that looks like. And then I open mine. Here's my ballot, and it lists, it shows, you can see all the things that I get to vote for. And I'm voting for president, US senator, and US representative, and then a bunch of judges. You get to vote for judges. That's the hardest thing because you know very little about the judges. It's hard to find that information. But you can find it, I think, in this county voting guide, if you can track that one down. Right, so look for voting materials in the mail. And then where do you vote or how do you vote? Please try option 1, which is to mail in or drop off your ballot. It's the easiest way to vote. And like I said, every registered voter receives a ballot in the mail at the address where they register to vote. And so the easiest thing is to fill that in the comfort of your own home while you're looking at all your campaign literature, and then put it in the mail or drop it off at a drop-off site. And then if you're voting in person, you need to find your designated polling place. The QR code here takes you to the Secretary of State page that will show you how to find your polling place. Or you can just Google, where is my polling place? And it's going to take you to a page where you can find that. And then the last thing I want to tell you is that if you live on campus, the voting locations at the pyramid, at the point at the pyramid, which is not at the tip of the pyramid, which is where you think the point would be. It's at the bottom of the pyramid, but it's called the point. Now they have early voting on March 2nd, 3rd, and 4th from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then on election day, March 5th from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And so that's all the voter resources that I wanted to share. Are there questions about all that?
I wanted to ask, actually, for those who are curious, if, for example, I'm a registered Democrat, am I still allowed to vote for a Republican candidate? Because sometimes people might not be happy with the current president, and it's some states have closed primary and then some have open primary. So just want to make sure that students are aware that they're who they can vote for.
Mm-hmm. So for the presidential primary, you can only vote for the candidates for the party that you're registered for. So if you're a Democrat and you're fed up with the Democrats and you want to vote in the Republican primary, you just go and you re-register and you put in your new party preference, and then you will have the ability to vote in the Republican primary. And you need to do that by February 20th. So you've got 5 days to change your party preference. All right. Or so if you want to change from Republican to the Peace and Freedom Party, you just re-register by February 20th. Now, there are open primaries. So I do believe that the race for US Senator is an open primary, which means that everybody votes in one primary and it's not divided up by party.
Thank you. And then wanted to touch upon exactly how exactly does the candidates advance the general election? How do they make it through? So students are aware exactly how primary elections work and what they're actually meant for as well.
Okay, that's a really good question. So let's start with the presidential primary. Every official party is going to elect one person to represent their party in the general election. So let's just talk about the two parties. The Democrats will choose one candidate and the Republicans will choose one candidate, and those candidates go on to the general election. And so everybody's predicting it's going to be Biden versus Trump, unless something, really drastic happens. And so those are what we call closed primaries. The Democrats vote for the Democrat candidate, Republicans vote for the Republican candidate. Those candidates go on to the general election. Now, what we have for voting for US Senator and for House of Representatives is an open primary, which means that there's a big long list of people running for Senate. Some of them are Democrats, some of them are Republicans, some of them are something else. And whoever are the top two people out of that election go on to the general election. And so typically that's going to be, it just turns out to be one Republican and one Democrat. But it could conceivably be two Democrats or two Republicans get the top votes, in which case those two would go on to the general election. And so the primary is about deciding who shows up at the general election. And if it's a presidential primary, each party votes on their candidate. And if it's something else in California, it's an open primary where everybody votes for a big long list of all the candidates, and the top two go on to the general election.
Thank you for sharing that. And one of our attendees asked if the session is recorded, if they'll be able to access this and rewatch the session later for those who joined late. I don't know if Ricky, you might be able to answer that question.
Yeah, Ricky, I thought I saw that it was being recorded.
I see that's being recorded as well, but I think they just want to know if they'll be able to rewatch the webinar at a later date, or if
yes.
It's going to be posted somewhere.
Yes, I will make sure that it gets posted somewhere. And if you're in my class, I can distribute that link. And if you want to see it and you're not in my class, I will put my email in the chat, and so you can email it to me, or email me, and I will send you the link. Here we go.
Thank you. And it seems that we're almost out of time. If there's any additional questions, last minute question, I'm more than happy to answer them from anyone in the audience.
Okay.
If there's no more, well, thank you, Dr. Johnson, for the great presentation, very full of useful information. I just want to say for all CSUOB students who are in this call, the League of Women Voters will provide a $10 Starbucks gift card, and it'll be sent to your student email address you use to register to attend the webinar. Don't forget, there is a voting center on campus in the Point in Simpson's room A and B, and you can vote there beginning Saturday, March 2nd. You can check the website csuob.edu/vote for the times as well. Also, the campus has a mail-in ballot on Upper Campus near the College of Education. So if anyone does want to drop off a ballot, then they have the ability to do so as well on Upper Campus. Thank you all for coming today. Have a nice evening, and also don't forget to go vote on March 5th. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.